Hey guys, welcome back. We are still talking about separation trauma in terms of manifestation, and this is the third part in that piece of the chapter called The Formation of Beliefs. To make things more difficult, the emotion of the traumatic event often gets disconnected from the memory, if there is a memory. For most adoptees, the trauma takes place during the period of childhood amnesia or implicit memory. This means that the events of their lives are having a profound effect on their perceptions and on neurological connections on the brain, but there will be no recall of the events. So, for example, there has been a theory that has gone around and it has since been disproven. It is called the blank slate theory, and I have spoken about it. Sorry, guys. So the idea that babies are adopted at birth, people assume that because the baby is immediately taken from their biological parent, that they won't recall that that memory, that maternal separation, right? So they assume that because you can separate the child and then introduce what we now know as stranger, right? Or the adoptive parent taking place of the birth parent, that everything will be fine and dandy, right? But the thing is that even though we may not directly recall that maternal separation, we can't recall if our biological mother held us or those days in the hospital. That doesn't mean that our body can't hold on to that trauma, because that's exactly what happens. And then that trauma manifests itself into mental illness and neurological diseases, chronic illness, just some examples, right? So there is a book called The Body Keeps Score. Now, that is not a book that I would recommend in terms of, there's a lot of problems with the author, but the idea is that your body holds on to the trauma. Now, there are other books that I would recommend that does talk about that same idea, and I will be reading that in the future, so just stay with me here. You can also look at adopteereading.com, which is another great resource that has adoptee approved books on all sorts of subjects when it comes to adoption, whether it's international, interracial, stories by adoptees, stories by adoptive parents, and so forth. So definitely check it out if you're looking for more books to read on your own. Anyway, we're going to continue on. Many adoptees, as well as birth mothers, will react to a reminder of the traumatic event as if it were the event happening in the present. So, aka like PTSD, right? You have there's a specific term. You're living in that moment, right? It's called a flashback, right? It's like a flashback of that moment. And it can manifest itself in different ways. It's not always the way that it's seen in movies or shows, right? But it's definitely a flashback where you could be triggered by something. So for adoptees, birthdays are often one of those triggers, right? Gotcha Day, aka your adoption day, can be very triggering. Mother's Day could be very triggering. Your place of your birth could be triggering, or something like that. Sorry, I just went off track. For adoptees who experience their trauma before conscious memory, these are feelings and emotions which they can't seem to connect to any event. These are the implicit memories, which will be explained in more detail in chapter 2, I think, in the next chapter. It says in the next chapter, so I'm assuming chapter 2, which influence one's sense of self and others, one's emotional responses and behavior, and in some cases, psychological responses, without there being any hint about the cause of these manifestations. Feelings of anger, hostility, panic, and sadness can come seemingly out of nowhere. Disassociation often occurs, accompanied by distortions in perceptions. So if you watch any of my shorts that I've posted up on this channel, or if you follow us on TikTok, I do talk about disassociating. So some are like daydreaming, for example, or watching a lot of movies, maybe specific movies that you can kind of just wrap your head around, or reading a lot. I mean, there's so many different ways to dissociate, but just keep in mind, it is extremely common for adoptees to disassociate and not realize that that is what they are doing. Okay. These distorted perceptions become disorganized and imprinted as beliefs about oneself. The defective baby, quote unquote, belief is one of them. Because babies instinctively know that mothers don't give up their babies, most adoptees seem to blame themselves for their own relinquishment. This belief is consistent with the way that children respond to trauma. As Van der Kolk says, quote, many traumatized individuals, especially children, tend to blame themselves for having been traumatized, according to his 1996 book. The quote-unquote bad baby belief allows the child to organize in his or her own distorted way something which has been completely disorganized. The inexplicable begins to make sense, and the victim can believe that he or she was not completely helpless in the situation. If I had been a better baby, I would not have lost my mother. There is the illusion of control and the preservation of the idea of the birth parent as good. Yet there is an altered perception of self and others. This is manifest in a sense of being unworthy, flawed, undeserving. Equally distorted are the adoptee's perceptions about others who matter in her life or his life. The adoptive mother seems to bear the most distortion, probably because she was the first person with whom the adoptee interacted with, and because she was not the mother to whom the baby was connected. So again, when it comes to the blank slate theory, they assume that you can just attach, right? You can just immediately have this connection, and they assume, well, babies are just babies, they just cry and they poop and they eat and all that jazz. But what they don't realize, or at least it wasn't recognized at the time, is that the first 3 months of a baby's life is considered the fourth trimester. And we're constantly talking about this because it is extremely important. All that baby knows is the smell of the mother's voice, and the mother's heartbeat. So when you take that away, whether that is due to adoption or because of an illness, even if it's temporary, say the mother is dying or needs to go through surgery, or the baby is sick and needs to go into NICU, this all causes trauma. So these are things that we're now recognizing, and it's kind of been recognized for a little while, but not enough to the point where a lot of society understands these psychological and medical issues, right? Or the realizations and the studies that have been done. So let's keep that in mind. We are not blank slates. We need our biological family. And not that I prefer to compare, but for the second, we can recognize these things with animals such as puppies and kittens, that we have to keep them with their biological mother at least for an extended period, right? It's usually 8 to 12 weeks for these, young babies to adjust to the world before they can go off to homes, right? If they're, I hate to say it, being adopted, or being bought in the case of breeding. But yet we can't give that same extent to humans. And that's where the issue lies, is that oftentimes animals have more rights than adoptees, human adoptees, I should say. Not just in terms of by government law, which is absolutely true, but also in terms of access to their medical information and their biological history. Even with shelters, often enough. Now, that's not to say you can get all the information, but you can get a whole lot. So it's quite kind of sad. And again, the terms adoption, if you guys haven't been following me for a while, please go check out my my reading of Lori Carangelo's The Chosen Children 2021. She does actually talk about the term adoption and how it was then used, for example, for shelters, animal shelters and highways and Cabbage Patch dolls and all of these things. So really, we started with humans, like myself, and then people like to use the word because, they think it's this wonderful thing, without realizing that it's extremely dehumanizing. So yeah, anyway, we're going to continue on. I will see you guys next time for talking about anxiety.